Welcome, everybody, to this week's episode of Generation Jihad. I'm Tom Joscelyn, and I'm joined again this week by my colleague, Bill Roggio.
Hi, everyone.
We're lining up some guests for future episodes. We still have to finalize those details, but this week it's just the two of us again. We're going to discuss Pakistan, America's duplicitous ally in what was formerly known as the Global War on Terror. And I say formerly known as Global War on Terror because for years the U.S. military has been operating under the pantheon of something called overseas contingency operations. Right, Bill? That's one of your favorite phrases, I know.
Yeah, it's a great euphemism for it. The Obama administration wanted to get away from that war on terror, and that term came up, and it's about as meaningless as it gets.
Yeah. Well, the two of us have been researching and reporting on Pakistani jihadi groups for many years. We decided to discuss Pakistan this week because recently a court there decided to overturn the convictions of Omar Saeed Sheikh. For those of you who don't know, Omar Saeed Sheikh is a notorious figure who allegedly planned and carried out the kidnapping of Wall Street Journal reporter Daniel Pearl in early 2002. This was right in the aftermath of 9/11. These was when tensions were all-time high, and everybody was, of course, on edge with the terrorist threat. And Pearl's kidnapping and murder was sort of a flashpoint internationally. After he was kidnapped, Pearl was beheaded by Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the chief planner of the 9/11 hijackings, often known as KSM. He wasn't captured until more than a year later in March 2003 in the Pakistani city of Rawalpindi. KSM remains in detention at Guantanamo Bay to this day. Omar Saeed Sheikh, his alleged Omar Saeed Sheikh, his alleged accomplice, remains imprisoned as well. There's hope that a higher Pakistani court will vacate the decision to overturn his convictions, and the Pakistanis have wisely decided to keep Omar Saeed and his comrades in prison for the time being. Still, this whole episode is a good example of the long-standing problems that America has had with Pakistan, especially when it comes to Pakistan's relationship with jihadists, including groups allied with Al-Qaeda. After all, as some of you know, our website, FTD's Long War Journal, is banned in Pakistan and has been for some time. Reporters and others have told us a long time ago that they can only access the site through proxy servers in Pakistan. Bill, you remember that, Bill, and how that all went down when we first found out about the site being banned in Pakistan.
Yeah, Tom, it's so the Long War Journal's been banned in Pakistan for going on 8 years now. It'll be 8 years this summer. Look, and I think it's hard to say with so many, but this might be my greatest or our greatest professional accomplishment. The Pakistani government recognized the threat that we posed to their narrative, and they've silenced us inside Pakistan. I was first, in the spring, late spring, early summer of 2012, I start getting contacted by reporters who were operating in Pakistan, and also some readers as well. And they're saying, "Hey, Bill, how come, is your website down? What's going on?" And I was very perplexed. And then I was then contacted by an individual in Pakistan who I will not name because he'll probably wind up dead if so. And I was talking with him, and he was able to talk to someone within Pakistan, basically what's equivalent to their information ministry, and was able to confirm that the Long War Journal has indeed been banned. And the primary reason for banning us was our narrative, how we explained what the Pakistani state does to support jihadists, how it plays. And we'll get into the details of this as we go further in the episode, how they play favorites within the Taliban and jihadist groups. They fight some and then they support others. This reporting, and our reporting, of course, is listened to by a lot in the U.S. military and state and various levels of government. So the Pakistanis did not like this, and they did not want this message being broadcast throughout Pakistan, so they banned us. So people that are inside Pakistan have to get through us through a proxy server or other means. If they try to go through one of the Pakistani internet service providers, they just won't be able to hear us. They won't be able to hear it. Well, they might be able to hear our podcast, but they certainly won't be able to read the Long War Journal online.
So, what's ridiculous about this, of course, is that while we're banned in Pakistan, many jihadists aren't. So you can find jihadi content coming out of Pakistan quite regularly. Of course, we monitor some websites that are producing content based on the Pakistani jihadi scene very regularly. Those aren't banned, but we are. And, of course, our reporting is just based on the facts of what's going on. So if those facts are inconvenient for certain people, well, so be it. But let's give some brief history here on America's relationship with Pakistan and its role in jihadism, going back to the Cold War. Of course, it was during the Cold War that Pakistan was America's ally. And it was at that time the U.S., Saudi Arabia, and other nations contributed to the Mujahideen's cause in Afghanistan. And of course, it was back then, at that time, America's priority was to defeat the Soviets. So if you look around online, you could find a lot of different stories dealing with that era. Of course, we're not going to recount all of it here. But you also will see some stories suggesting that the U.S. was somehow working directly or was in cahoots with Osama bin Laden during the 1980s. And thus far, we haven't seen any evidence showing that is true. We've seen evidence showing that's almost certainly not true. And a lot of the Mujahideen who were fighting in Afghanistan at the time, they didn't go on to join al-Qaeda or any kind of international terrorist group. However, the U.S. did work with some unsavory characters, including they worked directly with a man named Jalaluddin Haqqani. And his legacy is an important part of our story this week. America's support for the Mujahideen, including Haqqani, has been romanticized in works such as George Krill's book, Charlie Wilson's War, which was turned into a movie starring Tom Hanks in the titular role. Well, Wilson, a colorful congressman from Texas, once described Haqqani as goodness personified. I think Bill and I would probably invert that and say he's more like badness personified, or was. In fact, that's because the reality of his life, his dossier, gives you exactly the opposite perception of what Charlie Wilson said about him.
And Tom, when you wrote an article on his death, I believe that was the title that you used. Is that correct?
Yeah, it was badness personified. I was inverting Charlie Wilson's description exactly. You can find that Long War Journal. Maybe we'll link to it in the post of this week's podcast. But Haqqani was one of the most infamous and duplicitous characters in the history of jihadism. In fact, Bill's reporting on the Haqqani network's operations in Afghanistan is probably part of what got us banned, I bet, because the Haqqanis have long been headquartered in Pakistan. And Haqqani was duplicitous because even though he was at one point a CIA asset in the 1980s, Haqqani harbored some deeply anti-American views, and he also was the chief benefactor of Osama bin Laden himself. In fact, Haqqani gave bin Laden and al-Qaeda's earliest cadres a foothold in Afghanistan, where some of al-Qaeda's earliest leaders were actually trained in camps in eastern Afghanistan that were run by the Haqqanis. Haqqani remained an al-Qaeda man until his dying day, which according to the Taliban came sometime in 2018. In fact, when his death was recognized by the Taliban, it was interesting to watch who eulogized him, including al-Qaeda's senior leadership, the Taliban, and others. It shows this sort of convergence of interests around this figure as well as others. In any event, today, his son, Sirajuddin Haqqani, is the deputy emir of the Taliban's Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. That's the organization that they're trying to resurrect throughout the entirety of the country. They're trying to resurrect their totalitarian emirate. And a wealth of evidence, including files recovered in Osama bin Laden's compound, show that Siraj is, like his father before him, closely allied with al-Qaeda to this day. And while the U.S. broke off its relationship with the Haqqanis in the 1980s, the Pakistani military intelligence establishment never did. Indeed, the Pakistanis have provided the Haqqanis with safe haven and likely more ever since. And the Haqqanis aren't alone. Other Taliban leaders and members have sheltered in Pakistan for years, allowing them to direct much of the insurgency in Afghanistan from Quetta and other locales we're going to get into. And again, that's probably why we drew the ire of the Pakistanis, because Bill was on this very early, like a pit bull, explaining to readers how so much of this insurgency in Afghanistan was really being run from Pakistan. And those are, of course, uncomfortable facts for a lot of people. In fact, I think when the history of the Afghan war is written, I think the role of those Pakistani safe havens will loom large. I think those safe havens are one of the main reasons the Taliban-led insurgency has been able to come roaring back after the group apparently suffered a swift defeat in late 2001. I say apparently because this is something Bill and I talk about quite often. In a future episode of Generation Jihad, we're going to re-examine the initial U.S.-led campaign in Afghanistan. Because, Bill, you agree, right, that the short version is we don't think that campaign was nearly as successful as claimed at the time or in the years since. After all, Osama bin Laden got away, didn't he?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. This is a whole nother episode. But yes, I would have done things a lot differently to ensure that bin Laden didn't get away, that the other al-Qaeda operatives would not have gotten away, would not have relied on local forces, local Afghan militias who were very pliable, to put it mildly. I would have sent in the full might of the U.S. military, cordoned that area, and nothing would have walked out alive if it didn't surrender.
And the bottom line is, of course, hindsight is 20/20, but from our perspective, hindsight should also get the historical record correct. And the initial invasion of Afghanistan was not nearly as successful. I know I'm repeating myself now, but it's true. Not nearly as successful as a lot of people claim. In any event, besides the Taliban, there are other jihadist groups that have prospered inside Pakistan, including several organizations that were involved in the Daniel Pearl kidnapping. The interesting thing about the Daniel Pearl story is that when you look at all the organizations that were involved in it, and there were several from the alphabet soup that exists in Afghanistan, what you find is that Al-Qaeda has its hooks into several different organizations at the time, and none of that was really properly accounted for in accounting of what Al-Qaeda looked like or how it works, and it's still part of the story to this day. But of course, that story isn't a one-way street. Some of the jihadists in Pakistan have boomeranged back against the Pakistani state, including the Pakistani Taliban, which is also closely allied with Al-Qaeda. In fact, Pakistani citizens are among the jihadists' principal victims, and I think that's a fact we shouldn't lose sight of here when we talk about this country. Of course, none of this is about demonizing the average Pakistani, far from it. I think Bill and I think and have concluded over the years that a lot of what the military and intelligence establishment is doing in Pakistan ultimately hurts their own citizens.
Yeah, Tom, the real, this is the real horrific thing is that what Pakistan with its military and intelligence service and elements of government has done is set up tens of thousands of its own citizens to the slaughter of groups like the movement of the Taliban in Pakistan and other jihadist groups that are allied with them. They are directly complicit for the murder of their own citizens because their foreign policy of supporting jihadists who will support their strategic depth is far more important to them than their own citizens' safety.
And we'll get into that a little bit more, and that's a long-standing part of the cultural problem here going back decades now that's evolved. Pakistan's actions have certainly bedeviled American policymakers for years, and the U.S. has struggled to come up with a consistent set of policies for dealing with Pakistani duplicity, including Pakistan's ongoing sponsorship of various jihadist groups. Bill, I thought we would start, sort of reviewing all this and getting into exactly what you were just talking about in terms of how these policies have hurt Pakistan itself. But I think we'd start with the days immediately after 9/11, when the State Department drew up this list of demands for the Pakistani state. And for listeners who may not remember, Secretary of State Colin Powell and Deputy Secretary of State Dick Armitage at the time, they drew up a list of 7 demands for the Pakistanis, and they delivered these in the days after 9/11. Pervez Musharraf, who was then the Pakistani president, purportedly agreed to meet these demands. This is a big deal. It's in his memoirs. It's in several accounts of the time. But did Pakistan really comply with this list of demands? And the short answer that Bill and I have come to is no, not entirely, and certainly not over the past 18 plus years. So, Bill, let's go through them. And if you, our listeners, want to follow along at home, the demands that we're going to talk about here at the outset can be found on page 331 of the 9/11 Commission report. This is one of several sources you can get them from, but it's probably the cleanest. And so what I would like to do is go through each of the 7 demands that the Pakistanis reportedly agreed to comply with. And then Bill and I are going to discuss them. We're going to start with the first one, the most obvious one, which is that the Pakistanis would stop al-Qaeda operatives at its border and end all logistical support for bin Laden. So that's the first demand. And Bill, what would you say about their performance in that regard?
I would say this is probably one where they somewhat look. It's a really tough one. Bin Laden being killed in Abbottabad. You and I believe that elements of the Pakistani state know that he was there, right? So I would say they didn't comply with this. It's a tough border. They did round up some al-Qaeda operatives at the onset. They allowed a drone campaign to target al-Qaeda, but then they complained when it killed members of the Pakistan or the Afghan Taliban or the Haqqanis, particularly, of course, which is an integral part of the Taliban. So, it's a mixed bag, but at the end of the day, I personally believe that if the Pakistani state wanted to round up every single al-Qaeda operative and every ally of al-Qaeda, it could do so. It knows where they are, and if it doesn't know where they are, they would bring in people to find out where they are sheltering.
Of course I agree, and I would say that the reason why you're saying it's a mixed bag, and I agree with this, is because in that initial outset here, after Dick Armitage of the State Department reportedly threatened Pakistan in some colorful language, and these demands were given to them, there certainly was cooperation in those first couple of years after 9/11 in terms of providing the U.S. with some support in hunting down operatives. But I always am hesitant to give them too much credit because we know of guys who got away. We know of guys who got away. And, of course, there have been bin Laden, as you said, showing up in Abbottabad, where we know that Pakistani-sponsored jihadist groups, including Harakat al-Mujahideen, which we're going to get into a little bit later, we know that they were part of the courier network that was bringing messages to and from bin Laden, and that's a Pakistani-sponsored organization. So, and we know that bin Laden, from the bin Laden files, actually was able to negotiate with parts of the Pakistani government from his safe haven, which is obviously curious. How was he able to reach out through his minions and negotiate a ceasefire at times? The bottom line is that we're suspicious, of course, about that whole thing, but I agree it's a mixed bag. Yes, they provided some help, but overall, part of the story here, part of the reason why al-Qaeda is alive in 2020, it's not all the reasons, but one of the reasons is because they didn't do quite enough.
Yeah, and to the fact that the overlap of these groups, right? So you have Harkat al-Mujahideen, or you have Jaish Mohammed, or you have Lashkar-e-Taiba. The Pakistani government wasn't going to move against these groups, and still doesn't move against these groups. And these groups support Al-Qaeda. Therefore, if you want to roll up the Al-Qaeda network, you have to get all of the tentacles. You can't just chop off one arm of the octopus and say everything's fine. And that's the real problem in all this. That's part of, Pakistan trying to play both ends, trying to placate the United States, trying to take out Al-Qaeda, but not taking out its pet terror groups. Therefore, the terror groups survive. It's a net win for them at the end of the day.
So now the second item is on the list of the demands of the State Department of Pakistan was to give the United States, this is a quote, folks, to give the United States blanket overflight and landing rights for all necessary military and intelligence operations. Bill, go.
Yeah, I would say this might be one of the only, of all the 7 listed here, the one that they probably followed through. Now, there are times where there's been tensions with the United States where they've restricted access to certain air bases and whatnot when the U.S. drone campaign was at its height inside Pakistan. And again, it's part of this problem. The U.S. wasn't just targeting Al-Qaeda. It was targeting members of the Pakistani terror groups and even members of the Afghan Taliban / Haqqani network. And the Pakistanis began to protest over this. So at times they would shut down an air base. They'd shut down a base that was used for drones. But, this is probably as close that we could get to us saying that they followed through on one of the demands.
And, to our listeners, I'm kicking myself right now because I had a point about the first bullet point. I'm going to come back to it right now because I can't believe I forgot to say this. Because I've obsessed on this for about close to 20 years, and I got my shot and I didn't say it. But here it is. That first bullet point includes the phrase, end all logistical support for bin Laden. Well, isn't that curious? That means the State Department's position was that the Pakistanis were providing logistical support for bin Laden and had to end that support. And so that's a very curious sort of phrase that stands out in history here. I got that off my chest. But we're going to move on to the third bullet point now, which is, and this is again the State Department's list of demands of the Pakistanis, to provide territorial access to U.S. and allied military intelligence and other personnel to conduct operations against Al-Qaeda. Bill?
Yeah, it's, again, a mixed bags. The U.S. had a base for drones that was located in Balochistan. It had intelligence operatives and military were based in various areas in Pakistan. Yet they were prohibited from going into places like the FATA, the federally administered tribal agencies. This is where North and South Waziristan and other tribal agencies are located. This was the heart of Al-Qaeda's base in Pakistan. It wasn't just there, and by the way, that was very myopic for the U.S. to focus on Al-Qaeda just in North and South Waziristan, but that's a whole different discussion. So the few times that the U.S. launched cross-border raids with personnel, they were protested vigorously by the Pakistani government. They would issue statements. So yeah, again, it's a mixed bag, and the U.S. also has been risk averse in operating in places like, and rightfully so. These are the heart of darkness: North Waziristan, South Waziristan, Khyber, Orakazai. All the tribal areas were really Taliban and Al Qaeda havens. Especially at the up until about 2012. And by the time 2012 rolled around, the U.S. desire to actually engage in Pakistan really started to drop off. So, again, I would just call this a mixed bag, but it's a net win for the jihadists because the U.S. never really got to get in there and root it out. We had successful operations with the drone campaign and killed very senior Al-Qaeda leaders and military leaders, bomb makers, guys who were plotting against the West, and so on and so on. But Al-Qaeda still exists today, so the campaign had a lot of tactical success, but did not lead to the strategic collapse of Al-Qaeda.
And it's interesting. I remember one of the files recovered at bin Laden's compound that you and I have talked about for a while, in which Atiya Abdulrahman, his Libyan lieutenant, who was really sort of his aide-de-camp at the time of bin Laden's death, Rahman is sort of summarizing the Al-Qaeda operations at the time. And this is sort of mid-2010, the peak of the drone campaign, when this is supposed to be the death knell for Al-Qaeda. And Rahman says, that basically the Al-Qaeda organization is not operating on a high tempo, but it's not operating on a low tempo either. It was operating at a medium tempo. And this was at sort of the height of the drone campaign, at a time when they're supposed to be pinned in, waiting for the last final kill strike. And of course, that final kill strike didn't come, even with the death of bin Laden. Al-Qaeda survived. So let's move on to the next one. The next one on the list, this is number 4, was to provide the United States with intelligence information. Well, that's pretty broad. Bill?
Yeah. Again, we were able to capture some key Al-Qaeda leaders in the cities, as you mentioned, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the planner, the chief executor of 9/11. We captured him in Rawalpindi. So you did have FBI and CIA operating and capturing some Al-Qaeda. But again, not the satellite groups that support them. Not only did the groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish Mohammed, not only did they survive, but they thrived. I mean, so the U.S. Good example. The head of Lashkar-e-Taiba has a $5 million bounty on his head, right? It's probably been 10 years maybe that he's a specially designated global terrorist. His group Lashkar-e-Taiba is on declared foreign terrorist organization. Even in Pakistan, it's listed as a terrorist organization. And yet he's on TV. He's he meets with Pakistani generals and political figures, and he has a whole town where they train Lashkar-e-Taiba fighters. He's currently in prison right now, but he's been in and out of prison numerous times merely to placate the West. This time he's in prison because Pakistan was going to get put on something called the gray list, which would have hindered their ability to conduct financial transactions globally. So then they have to show that they're doing something. But then a court will come along and overturn his conviction, and he'll be back out. He's basically the Teflon Don of Pakistan. Pakistan knows where he is. If they were providing intelligence and cooperating with the U.S., they'd pick him up off the street. They'd go to his home, knock on the door, slap cups on him, and send him to the United States. But they'll never do that because they're not fully cooperating with the United States.
And this is, of course, Hafez Saeed you're talking about.
Yes, Hafez Saeed. Yes, correct.
This is a guy who, when bin Laden was killed, mourned him as a martyr.
On Pakistani television.
On Pakistani television, yeah. All right, so the next one, number 5, is for the Pakistanis would continue to publicly condemn the terrorist acts. So I guess that's publicly condemn 9/11 in particular, because they certainly condemn some terrorist acts, but not others, right, Bill? And we're going to get into that more. We don't have to dwell on it too much here.
Yeah, won't dwell on that at all. I mean, only the attacks that it disapproved of. Terrorist attacks against India, for instance, they were just fine. It was selective, just like they're selective against the groups that they target.
Yeah, so the 6th point was to cut off all shipments of fuel to the Taliban and stop recruits from going to Afghanistan. Now, this is an easy one. The bottom line is that obviously this did not happen. Basically there were interruptions. Obviously the Pakistanis helped capture Al-Qaeda members and others who were fleeing the Tora Bora Mountains in late 2001. They stopped they helped in shutting off some of the retreat that Al-Qaeda had, but not all of it. But in terms of going the other way, going back into Afghanistan, well, this is the big problem, right? This is one of the biggest problems, is that this cross-border traffic has continued for years, right, Bill?
Yeah, exactly. And I'll just give one example. There's a group, its acronym is TNSM, and was led by a man named Sufi Muhammad. He just recently passed away of natural causes. So at the very onset of the U.S. invasion, Sufi Muhammad, he sent more than 10,000 fighters to go ahead and fight with the Taliban inside Afghanistan. A couple of years later, his son, Mullah Fazullah, he became the head of what became the movement of the Taliban in Pakistan. He became their head of their operations in a district known as SWAT. And then he later became the emir of the movement of the Taliban in Pakistan. And of course, that group was openly at war with the Pakistani government. And we'll get into this. Took over a large area of the Northwest Frontier Province and all of the Fatah for several years. We have story after story of this with Pakistan, and it just I could sit there and say, he's the guy that shows why Pakistan's duplicitous, until I look at the next guy and the next guy and the next guy.
Yeah, and part of the problem there, too, is, of course, there's a stack of U.S. terrorist designations identifying facilitators in Pakistan who are working for the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and others and sending recruits over the border in Afghanistan. So we're going to give them an F on that one.
Absolutely.
So
F minus, is that possible?
I don't think that's possible, but
Okay.
but we can trademark it, whatever.
Sure.
And so the seventh one was, and I love this one. If the evidence implicated Bin Laden and Al Qaeda, and the Taliban continue to harbor them, meaning Al Qaeda and Bin Laden, then the Pakistanis would have to break relations with the Taliban government. Well, no, this didn't happen. This is the one that's probably the biggest one on the list, because the whole point here today is the Taliban has been fighting to resurrect its Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, as we said. And this has been a Pakistani-sponsored endeavor, basically, to resurrect the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. And so, quite the opposite of breaking relations with the Taliban government, the Pakistani safe havens have played an instrumental role in the Taliban resurrecting its government and attempting to do so.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. It's, look, I am of the mind that the Taliban would have been a shadow of itself if it did not have the state support of.
Oh, Bill, you use shadow of its former self.
I know.
Oh, Bill, you use that phrase. That's the old Obama phrase that's now being repeated by Secretary Pompeo.
Got to turn it
and
back
others.
on him, Tom.
Yeah, I mean, you could set up the criteria for what would actually take to be a shadow of your former self. But we're laughing because this phrase is just sort of mindlessly repeated by American officials, and it shows that they're not really thinking about this when they say stuff like this. You know?
My tongue is in my cheek, Tom, as I say.
Yeah, I know it is, but I don't know. I just want to make sure listeners understand that, yeah, that's the case. In any event, so I mean, Bill, one of the things that you turned me on to early on was that the Pakistanis were talking about the difference between the good Taliban and the bad Taliban. And I remember you writing this up, and I was just thinking, what? And this ended up becoming a big thing that I ended up having to deal with in my career when I was doing lectures and everything else, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But explain to people what this whole game is with the good Taliban and the bad Taliban for Pakistan.
Yeah, it really, and to be clear here, this isn't something I made up as a construct, right? This is something that emerged from the Pakistani security establishment, right? They came up with this idea, well, there's good Taliban and there's bad Taliban. We, the Pakistanis, will work with the good Taliban and we'll fight the bad Taliban. Well, what is a good Taliban and what is a bad Taliban? From Tom and my perspective, it's a distinction without difference. There is no such thing. They're all bad. They all have the same goals. It's just, let me explain what the good Taliban is. The good Taliban to the Pakistanis these are the ones who don't battle the Pakistani state, and they forward Pakistan's national security goals, particularly in places like Indian-held Kashmir and in Afghanistan, right? So it doesn't have to just be Taliban. So groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba that primarily fight in Kashmir, but also fight in Afghanistan. The Afghan Taliban, of course, are good Taliban. That's why they're supported by the Pakistani state. And that whole alphabet soup of jihadist groups, Jaish Mohammed and Harkat ul-Mujahideen and Hizbul Mujahideen and so on and so on. They're all good Taliban because they play nice against the Pakistani state. Pakistan sets training camps up, particularly for the Kashmir-based jihadists, right? And they arm them, they train them. Lashkar-e-Taiba's raid in India, in Mumbai, in December 2007, that was carried out by Lashkar-e-Taiba with ISI, the Inter-Service Intelligence Agency, Pakistan's Inter-Service Intelligence Directorate. That's their military intelligence. Members of that were directing the operations, giving orders and advice to the fighters as they're slaughtering people in hotels and on the streets. That's the good Taliban.
That's the good
Taliban people.
Right.
Yeah. So the ones killing Americans and Afghans and anyone else they can get their hands on inside of Afghanistan.
Especially
Indians. Yep. And look, and this is all born on the Pakistan strategy of strategic depth. We could do a whole show on that, but we won't. But strategic depth basically is Pakistan recognizes that it's smaller and has less resources than its mortal enemy, India. So what does it do? It uses asymmetrical warfare and as well as to battle the Indians. It views these people that'll come to their defense if there is a true war with India. And Afghanistan is literally a territorial strategic depth where they believe if the Indians do invade, Pakistan can move some of its forces across the Hindu Kush into Afghanistan and have that sort of line to keep their operations going. So and again, they believe they believe the good Taliban will back them with that. They certainly back them by conducting terror attacks against India and the West.
And the other part about this too, Bill, is it's not just, of course, sort of realpolitik strategy for
Yes.
depth in the region. There is a convergence here on ideology. This
Yes.
ideology sunk in within the parts of the Pakistani establishment, not all of it. Obviously, some are real politicers, others are real believers, and then others are sort of opposed to this, as we'll get into a little bit within the Pakistani military intelligence establishment. But the bottom line is, part of the frightening aspect in all this is that there are a certain number of true believers within Pakistan and the military intelligence establishment, and that's sort of part of what I worry about long run in all this.
Yeah, and the true believers and the realpolitik, realists, whatever you would call them, they definitely outnumber the ones who oppose it, because there are members inside Pakistan's intelligence service and militaries who have supported the fight against the bad Taliban, and as well as the good Taliban. But sometimes I actually think, and I can't prove this, but I have a feeling that a lot of them have been rolled out as cannon fodder in the battles in the Fatah and the Northwest Frontier Province. So what is the good Taliban, right? I'm sorry. So we just went through the good Taliban. What is the bad Taliban? These are the jihadists who oppose the Pakistani state and commit violence against the Pakistani state. The number one on this list is a group called the Movement of the Taliban in Pakistan. It's what we call the Pakistani Taliban. That's why we have to use the term Afghan Taliban, Pakistani.
Bill, it's probably good to give a little insert here to tell people about how in May 2010, you first learned that the Pakistani Taliban was behind the Times Square bombing with Faisal Shahzad. This is how closely you and I have been covering this group and what they're doing in Pakistan, that they gave you a hat tip to say that they were responsible for it. It's worth maybe just giving a few sentences on that.
Yeah, sure. And again, I think I'd mentioned this on a previous episode. It's another moment in your career where you can't take enough showers to take the stench off this one. It was a great scoop and really helped explain our worldview and gave us a lot of credibility, and yet it comes from a group that I despise. So I believe it was May 1st, May 2nd, the night that the Faisal Shahzad, he attempted to detonate a car bomb in Times Square, New York City. Thank goodness it didn't go off, but they release. We're up, we're tracking everything. I'm looking at my email, and I get this email it says TTP spokesman. TTP is Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, which is Movement of the Taliban in Pakistan. It says TTP spokesman at gmail.com. And I'm like, And he says, we like your work mostly. And
mostly meaning you had reported accurately that Hakamullah Masood had survived a drone strike. And
right.
they were very happy that you were saying he was alive. So
yeah, I have to take a step back on that one. So everyone had reported Hakamullah Masood he was the head of the Movement of the Taliban Pakistan in January of this year. And he was dead in so many different ways that there was not a credible report of his death. He was killed in a drone strike. He was killed in a battle with Pakistani forces. He was killed in a meeting between the Taliban leaders, Pakistani Taliban leaders. He was killed by his driver. His wife put a knife in his back. You name it.
For our fellow nerds out there, he was basically the Pakistani equivalent of Mukhtar Belmokhtar.
Yes.
Sort of these jihadi vampires who they just can't be killed. I mean, you could cut his head off and put a spike through his heart, and I'd have to believe it to see it that he's actually dead.
Exactly. I mean, and the dates were different of his death. And you're right. I mean, in our opinion, they are vampires. You need to drive a straight stake through the heart,
and
chop
even
the
then,
head off, and
even
expose
then,
the sunlight.
I'm not buying it. Even then, So
So we I get this email, and I'm watching these videos start uploading on YouTube, and I'm like, what the hell is this? I didn't know if it was a gag or whatever. And then once the video uploads, I could see there's like 2 views on it. I'm the second. I see, lo and behold, it's Hakamullah Masood and Faisal Shahzad, and I believe they were holding up a newspaper or something well, no, actually, no. It was they actually claimed the attack, right, or the attempted attack. So I knew it right there. I have 2 scoops. I got, well, Hakamullah Masood is definitely alive, all right? I got that one right. And here we go. Here's the Times Square bomber meeting with him. So now we didn't know at the time that Faisal Shahzad was the guy, but so then we also had one from the head of his suicide bombers. That he was also meeting with, if I recall correctly, he was meeting with Faisal Shahzad as well. So I had a story here, and in the meantime, I believe the Obama administration was saying, "Oh, this could be right wing terrorism. This could be this. This could be that."
Yeah, I mean, Attorney General Eric Holder didn't know who it was. It was funny. We're watching this video, and you had U.S. officials didn't. I mean, I'm not blaming them or criticizing them. They just didn't know at the time. They didn't have the intelligence to know. And yet here's this video on YouTube from this guy who's happy that you're reporting that he's alive and saying, basically we did it. And this is to tie a bow on it. This is the bad Taliban because they attack not only us but also the Pakistani state.
Right. They're the ones that are, not that the good Taliban aren't on board with the global jihad, by the way. They are. I mean, Lashkar-e-Taiba wants to help establish a global caliphate.
No, Bill. You haven't heard. Secretary of State tells us that the Taliban has renounced Al Qaeda and is going to destroy it. So
yeah, right,
you gotta get with the talking points, Bill.
Yeah, I just tend not to. What can I say? Yeah. So the bad, but to the Pakistanis, right? The bad Taliban, Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, they launched a lot of attacks. Obviously, a group like the Islamic State would be bad Taliban to them. So they, that in a nutshell is that good Taliban, bad Taliban. Now, here's the problem with it. Yeah,
well, I just say with the bad Taliban, of course, again, just to emphasize this, I mean, these guys have killed an awful lot of Pakistanis.
Yes.
I mean, these guys have killed more Pakistanis than anybody else. So this is where the policy has really hurt Pakistanis themselves. And now you get into the problem, Bill. Explain why this is the problem, the whole thing, how it works.
And I'll go back to Sufi Muhammad, right? He was a good Taliban until he became a bad Taliban. He sent over 10,000 fighters to fight the U.S. inside Afghanistan. But then they wind up turning on the Pakistani state. There was an incident, and I don't want to go into the full details, but there's a place called the Red Mosque, and they declare in Islamabad, and they declare Sharia, and they start enforcing Sharia on the streets, and the Pakistani government and the military are like, oh boy, it was all was well and good when it was confined out to the fringes of Baluchistan and in the Fatah and whatnot. Where Al Qaeda, by the way, was establishing its Islamic Emirates. They had actually called it the Islamic Emirate of Waziristan. So much, as if you listen to last week's episode, so much for the notion that the Islamic State was the first one to declare an Islamic Emirate. This was going back in 2003, 4, 5. And so when you had the Red Mosque, right, go back to the Red Mosque. This happens, the government has to move on it. They're beating people in the streets, hauling them off, assaulting police officers, and they're going block by block and expanding their control and forcing their version of Sharia. So the military raids the Lal Masjid or Red Mosque. They capture one of its two founders and head clerics, and and some people are killed. So this was like a turning point for many of the good Taliban, right? So shortly after this, you have the movement of the Taliban in Pakistan is formed. Now, not all of the Taliban groups in the tribal areas joined them. They stayed away, but they still supported the bad Taliban, the movement of the Taliban in Pakistan. Then you had an uprising. You had an insurgency. They take over all of the tribal areas. Nearly all of them, except for like the agency capitals in a couple of places. North and South Waziristan are fully controlled by the Taliban. Most of Khyber was. It was just a mess. And then they started expanding beyond into the Northwest Frontier Province. So the tribal areas was like think of it like, in terms like Guam or Puerto Rico. They're part of America, but not a full state. That's how the tribal areas, they were sort of specially governed. So they were considered the Wild West and still are considered the Wild West of Pakistan. So the Taliban were in control of those, but they decide they're going to start expanding their influence. From 2007 to 2010, they take over numerous districts in the Northwest Frontier Province. So, yeah, it was the operations by the bad Taliban, but the good Taliban facilitated this. There's no way that North Waziristan can come under control of, the TTP without Hafiz Gul-Bahadur and his fighters backing, as well as the Haqqanis. The Haqqanis are based in Miram Shah in North Waziristan. They have a big mosque and whatnot.
In fact, with the Haqqanis, I mean, one of the things that's been amply demonstrated is the Haqqanis have harbored and worked with the Pakistani Taliban. And, right, I mean, this is how complicated and insidious this all gets, is that the Pakistani state is in bed with the Haqqanis. Well, meanwhile, the Haqqanis are in bed with the Pakistani Taliban, which is attacking the Pakistani state. It's what we've called the wheel of jihad, right? I mean, we sort of had, you know, basically if you think of Game of Thrones with that character Dany, she wanted to break the wheel of power, right? Corrupt, right? Well, we have this wheel of jihad in Pakistan, and nobody's broken it. It's still spinning. So
yeah, exactly.
So
and often, you know, I've heard from, let's just say, intelligence officials that they would believe that Haqqani fighters would just basically, oh, well, today we're going to go fight with the movement of the Taliban in Pakistan, and then tomorrow will be the Haqqani network again, and we'll go operate in Afghanistan. That's how things worked. So the good Taliban, what was considered good Taliban by the Pakistani state, was directly complicit in what the bad Taliban was doing. By 2009, the Taliban seized control of this district called Buner. This was after several successive peace deals. The Pakistani government actually negotiated peace with the Taliban in several of the tribal areas.
And you know, Bill, as you say in this, Bill, I'm kicking myself for not making more of a point of this when we were critiquing the current quote unquote deal with peace deal, right? It's a withdrawal deal between the U.S. and the Afghan Taliban, because the Taliban has a whole history of cutting similar type deals and using them to their advantage. But go ahead.
And you know, people will argue, well, that's the Pakistani Taliban, and this is the Afghan Taliban. They're two completely different animals.
Yeah, we're right back to good Taliban, bad Taliban, right? And the pathology of the Pakistanis then, you know?
And meanwhile, they fight the same, they operate the same, they think the same. The Afghan Taliban support the Pakistani Taliban, and the Pakistani Taliban support the Afghan Taliban. The Pakistani Taliban swear allegiance to the Afghan Taliban's emir. Maybe they might be part of the same network. So when the movement of the Taliban in Pakistan seized Buner, and by the way, they're also getting close to Pakistan's nuclear storage and weapons production facilities in the Northwest Frontier province, and that was freaking a lot of people out, both in U.S. government as well, of course, in the Pakistani government, because those Pakistani nukes are they believe, the only thing keeping India from invading and reconquering Pakistan. It was very, very tricky. At this point, the Pakistani military realized that, well, maybe those good Taliban aren't so good, or those Taliban aren't the good Taliban or what we thought they were. They're actually bad Taliban. So they fought them, and they retook control of the districts and much of the tribal areas as well. But the movement of the Taliban in Pakistan still operates in these areas, in a lot of the tribal agencies. They straddle both sides of the border. But one thing where you could see the mindset of the Pakistani military was we'll go back to Mumbai, right? In December 2007, and this is when that war, the Taliban's conquering of the Northwest Frontier province was going on. Lashkar-e-Taiba attacks Mumbai. Pakistan is going into full strategic depth mode here, and you actually had a corps commander let the game on, let out or give you a view of how they think. And in an interview, he described the movement of the Taliban as their, and this is a quote, wayward brothers, end quote. And then he implored them to come back to the fold. He said, look, you know, you may have killed a lot of our people and we fight you, but we need to get together and fight our real enemy, the Indians here.
And by the way, as we've now seen in the Bin Laden files, this is the files captured in Abbottabad when Bin Laden was killed, you know, senior Al-Qaeda officials, senior Al-Qaeda leaders reviewed the Pakistani Taliban charter and edited it. You know, you could see that, the Al-Qaeda leaders complained about some Pakistani Taliban operations, but there's a clear influence there over their operations, and they clearly see them, I think, and you think, as a cutout. In fact, that's the State Department's official position about the Pakistani Taliban, is that there's a symbiotic relationship. That's the State Department's words, between the Pakistani Taliban and Al-Qaeda, and we certainly have documented that many times. So this is why this wheel becomes so insidious, right? You have the good Taliban being sponsored by the Pakistani state. Meanwhile, they're working with the bad Taliban, which is attacking the Pakistani state, which is also, and they're also working with Al Qaeda. And so, where do you draw the line in all this? It becomes a total mess.
Yeah, that document is, I mean, and look, there's so many we could point to. And, the mask came off there. The movement of the Taliban in Pakistan, its charter was being written and edited by Al Qaeda. And people dismiss this as, see, the Pakistani Taliban doesn't like Al Qaeda and because of the tone that was being used in it. But guess what? But by what we could see, what they were talking about, that was all went through. So again, a fascinating document. We're gonna
have to get into that story more, I think, when we do our Bin Laden file episodes. And it's gonna have to be episodes because I still see people out there reporting inaccurate things about the Bin Laden files and what actually went down in Bin Laden's own role at the time of his death. And we've been compiling a sort of a last year of his life timeline of documents and files, which is absolutely fascinating. But the bottom line is that that symbiotic relationship almost certainly exists to this day, and it's one of the things that hasn't been solved. But Bill, you've gotten to know some of the good guys in Pakistan as well, and there was sort of one story that you and I were talking about earlier that we just had to include in the podcast this week. Why don't you talk about a little bit about that, about your invitation to Pakistan?
Yeah, this is interesting, and this is the thing that it's really difficult, or it's difficult for a lot of people to, everybody wants to see it black and white, right? All Pakistan is bad, all Pakistan is good. And I'm going to
say this while we're recording. Should we even say the general's name, or should we just say a general? I don't know if we want to.
Yeah, No, I have to. I kind of have to.
All right, I just want to make sure we don't get him in trouble. That's all.
I'm gonna say it.
Okay.
It happened. He never told me not to. The story doesn't work if I don't.
Okay.
And anyone who has half of a grain of knowledge, because got him into the headquarters, they'll know who it was.
Okay. Fair enough.
And they probably read his emails anyway.
There are plenty of good guys, and we just don't want to hurt anyone.
Yeah, I know. I think we have to. I thought about that and just was like, yeah. I mean, he did it openly. He did it openly from his email, his government email and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So.
All right, well, let's get into it. Just talk about the story a little bit.
So in 2007, General Tariq Khan, who was the commander of Pakistan's Frontier Corps, which is tasked with dealing with the tribal areas as well as some of the districts surrounding it, he invited me, actually, to come and take a tour of the Northwest Frontier Province with him, particularly go out to South Waziristan. So it would have been one of those, get on a helicopter, drive out, fly out to the base, look, here we are, and then leave, right? But, look, I was new to this, and it was probably a lot younger and a lot stupider, and I thought, hey, this might be an excellent idea. And I get to go to Pakistan, but one of my biggest concerns, and he invited me, by the way, because of our coverage of Pakistan, what was going on in the Northwest Frontier.
And he's legitimately fighting the jihadis. He's legitimately, doing the right work as we view it and all this stuff. He's somebody who should be celebrated for doing the good work. Yeah,
I asked around to friends and said, hey, what do you think of this guy? And everyone I talked to said, yeah, he's the real deal. He's on our side. We couldn't do a lot of what we do out there, what little we do, without his support. So now, Tom greatly opposed this.
When you told me this, I was gonna drive down to New Jersey and basically lock you in a closet, myself at that point in time. I mean, listen. We started off this episode with talking about Daniel Pearl, and I just think there's so many scenarios where that would have played out. I mean, it's not like we're unknown. Even though it was early on, we were still known enough in Pakistani jihadi circles at that point in time. And they couldn't guarantee your safety, and you got a wife and kids, and I just thought, what are you talking about? You're talking about going off to Waziristan. When you first told me on the phone, I said, oh, you've got to be drunk or something. This is insane, So
look, at this point in time, I was going out to Iraq. I've been to Afghanistan. I was doing in bed with the military. Obviously, understanding going out with the Pakistanis.
Very, very different going
very
out
different
with the U.S. military, the Kurds, or something like that in those war zones. This is a totally different scenario. Yeah.
No, look, and I had concerns as well. I was entertaining the idea, and
not enough concerns, Bill. Not enough concerns. But go ahead.
So look, and in my conversations with Khan, right, I told him I'm concerned. I said I know I have enemies in Pakistan. I said if I get in your custody, I will trust you to protect me. But how do I get to the airport from Peshawar to your headquarters without disappearing. And so now keep in mind, he's a soldier. I'm a former soldier, so he's razzing me. He's telling me I'm afraid. He's mocking me, and yet he couldn't secure travel from the headquarters. I kept persisting with him, and we're going back and forth. And then one day, his headquarters, which was at a large hotel in Peshawar, was hit with a suicide assault. And I believe around 50 people or so were killed in the attack. Man, just destroyed the hotel. And I get an email back from him about a day or two later, and he says, "Bill, maybe now is not a good time to come to Pakistan." He
said, think? Yeah.
And I said to him, "You think?" Right, exactly. And thinking about it afterwards, I never even considered the prospect of possibly being in his headquarters while a suicide attacker gets in. But that's how, in Peshawar at this time, the Taliban controlled a lot of the city. There were blockades. It was an absolute nightmare. They were enforcing Sharia in parts of the city. Peshawar was one of the largest cities in Pakistan. So this was the environment that we were dealing with. But this is a guy who he went out there and he fought the Taliban. He lost hundreds of soldiers doing so. So while we can sit there and denounce the Pakistani establishment, we have to understand that there are individuals who are what we would consider to be heroic figures, and it's so much harder for him to do what he does than, say, any other general, like a U.S. Army commander, to do in Iraq or any other place. Because not only does he have an enemy that's committed, but he's dealing with that nefarious element of the Pakistani state that has no problems with letting people disappear.
Yeah, it's a sad state of affairs, but that's the reality of the whole thing. Bill, I think we should cut ahead to a couple other stories we have through the years, including the time you were over, and I think it was in Germany, talking to the George C. Marshall European Center for Security Studies, and tell a little bit about the reaction when you were talking about the Taliban and the Haqqanis from folks you met there. And I've got a similar story. I think we should jump ahead to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's do that. So this was I want to say in the March of 2016. Get to fly over to Germany. I was stationed there for 2 years. In the 90s, so I was really looking forward to going to Germany. But I was invited to talk about the future of Pakistan. The future of Afghanistan. What is it going to look like several years down the line, particularly if the U.S. withdraws or significantly cuts forces? And I remember saying to the individual who invited me, I said, "Look, I'm not going to," he said, "Oh, there'll be, people from all countries, including Afghanistan and Pakistan." I said, "I cannot discuss Afghanistan without talking about Pakistan. And I'm not going to be the guy that shows up to pull punches. It's just not in my nature. Tell me right now, if you don't want me to, if I'm going to insult someone, just let me know, and, that's fine." He says, "No, come, let's do it." So, in the course of the discussion, I talk about the good Taliban, bad Taliban come up. And I start explaining how the Pakistani military, goes after the bad but not the good. And there was probably 4 or 5 Pakistani military officers, mid-level officers, captains, majors, lieutenant colonels, and they indignantly stand up and say, "That's not true. We're targeting all of them. We're killing the Haqqanis. We're killing Al Qaeda. We're killing the movement of Taliban." I said, "I believe you about the movement of Taliban in Pakistan, and I believe you about Al Qaeda, but name me a single Haqqani network commander, operative, the logistics guy, fundraiser. Name me one, just one, that you guys have killed in your operations." And they went silent and sat down, and I didn't hear another word from the Pakistanis on that issue because, to me it was, what we know, and it's possible that this stuff isn't advertised to not cause problems or whatnot. I don't believe it. But the silence of those Pakistani military officers told me everything I need to know, because they knew that it didn't happen, because if it had, they would have named one.
And meanwhile, the Haqqanis are killing Americans and Afghans in Afghanistan. They're targeting Americans, NATO forces. They're going after American citizens, service members, Afghans, and they're committing some of the biggest attacks in the history of Afghanistan. So the biggest terrorist attacks that we know of in Afghanistan were launched by the Haqqanis. I had a similar experience. This is years ago now. And it was just a bizarre episode, but I was down at Joint Special Operations University in Florida, which is near Fort McDill. And I was given a lecture on terrorist groups and terrorist financing. You remember, Bill? It was like at one point it was like all about terrorist financing, right? So
yes.
you had to frame everything when it came to terrorist financing. Okay, so I'm doing a presentation, and I get to the Taliban part of it and Taliban financing and what we know about it. And I got a similar objections, both from the Pakistanis. So just to give some perspective, in this room, I think there were over 100 uniformed officers in the room. So you had like generals on down. I mean, you had a lot of bigwigs from these foreign militaries were in the room, and then it's me, giving this talk, and I'm just the nerd, going over this stuff. And I get to the part about the Taliban, and I have a similar reaction. The Pakistanis are indignant that I'm talking about the Taliban as a terrorist organization. And I also had a British officer start telling me, oh no, the Taliban are terrorists. They're blah, blah, blah. I'm like, you gotta be kidding me. I said, look, at this point in time, I forget when exactly this was, but I remember it was like the week prior, a Taliban suicide bomber had blown himself up in the middle of a market, killing a bunch of civilians. And I said, is that a terrorist act or not? Are you going to tell me that's not a terrorist act, given that the Taliban kills more civilians in Afghanistan than anybody else in terrorist attacks constantly? I mean, this is ridiculous. And of course, the Connies, which are part of the Taliban, are become a designated terrorist organization. It's one of the contradictions in all this to this day is that the Taliban itself is not designated as a terrorist organization, whereas the Connies are, and gets as the FTO status within the U.S. I think that's right, Bill? Yeah, so I think
that's right.
Yeah, it's one of the many contradictions here in all this. Doesn't really make any sense, even as Sir Judin Haqqani is the number 2 of the Taliban. Somehow the Taliban overall isn't designated. But it was sort of, this whole finger-wagging episode, and I recounted the details and went through it and did a little bit of the bad Taliban, good Taliban routine as well, and why that didn't make any sense. But, at the end of the day, it really is this wheel of jihad thing, where basically, we don't have a denarius figure who's going to go in and break the wheel, it's just going to keep on going. And the U.S. is looking to leave. That wheel's still spinning, and, we can hope that nothing's going to come of it. We certainly do. But, who knows going forward here? Bill, I don't see any reason to believe it's going to stop. I mean, I think that the withdrawal from Afghanistan is probably going to be it has the potential to sort of inject further life into the Frankenstein, right? The jihadi.
Oh, I absolutely agree. The wheel's just going to start spinning faster and faster. I mean, and that I completely agree. What Pakistan is learning from all of this, from this mess, is that strategic depth and support of jihadist groups. Well, it works. The United States tried to fight it for almost 20 years and couldn't, or wouldn't, or both. I believe both.
At one point on that, Bill, that's so well said that they've learned that the Pakistani states learned that. And part of the reason they've learned that is the erratic policy making by Americans, right? When you say couldn't or wouldn't, I mean, we had, early on the Obama administration, for example, you had the McChrystal Plan was put out, in which identified Pakistani safe havens, the Quetta Shura Council, and others as big parts of the problem, right? But there's never been any consistent policy by the Americans to take that on. You flash forward, they dropped the ball on it. They just sort of, decided they can't do anything about it. You flash forward years later, in 2017, the Trump administration decides to get tough on Pakistani safe havens under Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster. When he becomes National Security Advisor, he decides to put appropriately, in our view, entirely appropriately, put in a get tough on Pakistan safe havens policy. Of course, that continues for a little bit while, and then all of a sudden they really drop interest in that, even though they withhold funds and they make a big stink out of it. And then all of a sudden, we're going to forget about that. And now you go to today, Bill, with the deal with Special Representative Khalilzad negotiating with the Taliban in Doha at the behest of Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. And you and I have witnessed this, and this is just amazing now to watch Khalilzad after all these years, to watch all this and everything we've documented at FDD's Long War Journal, to watch the U.S. government now sort of bow down to the Pakistanis and proclaim them a partner for the peace, even though we know Khalilzad knows that's not true.
Yeah, Tom, let's go back. I testified right next to him in front of Congress in July of 2016. It's literally congressional record. Just listen to this.
That first, Pakistan is now a state sponsor of terror. There is no question that the Pakistani military and the Pakistani intelligence agency, the ISI, the inter-service agency, supports the Haqqani network, which we regard, the United States has regarded as a terrorist organization. Point two, it's also clear that the Pakistani military and Pakistani intelligence provide sanctuary and support for the Taliban, which is an extremist organization that provided sanctuary for Al-Qaeda in the early period. And even recently, the leader of Al-Qaeda, Zawahiri, pledged allegiance to the new leader of the Taliban. So the relationship continues.
And yet, within 2 years, he turns around and calls Pakistan a partner for peace. I mean, how does that happen? And there's no consistent policy, and he's an individual who's willing to do what it takes to get whatever prestige or whatever he is getting out of this. He's willing to change his opinions on the fly, and our entire policy is just whatever policy that is. It's incoherent. It's been incoherent for well over a decade and a half. There was an opportunity to put the pressure on Pakistan. That drone campaign really created problems for the Pakistani military establishment. It was difficult for Pakistan to call itself the protectors of the Pakistani people when it can't slow flying aircraft to just hover over its territory. Because look, the reality is that the Pakistani military wanted to shoot down a U.S. drone. They could have done that, no problem. Those things fly under 200 miles an hour, and they just sort of fly figure eights up in the sky. The worst Pakistani jet in their arsenal will knock one of them out of the sky. Hell, they could get a biplane and go ahead and knock it out of the sky. And so it created problems, but we just squandered every time. We became fearful. What happens if those nukes get loose? What happens if there's a war between India and Pakistan? And meanwhile, all the while, we let the Pakistanis facilitate the murder of Americans inside of Afghanistan.
And of course, the withdrawal agreement says not a word, not boo, about Pakistan. And that really tells you the whole story of the war in Afghanistan from our perspective. If Ken Burns is alive to do a multi-part series for PBS on Afghanistan, as depressing as it is to watch through it, this would have to be an episode or two, be the role of Pakistan in all this and how duplicitous the Pakistani military intelligence establishment is, a one-time Cold War ally for the U.S. that just decided that they weren't going to crack down on the jihadis in the way that they needed to, from our perspective, should have. And this is something that, Bill, it's going to be something we're going to have to keep covering going forward, even after the U.S., assuming they move forward with the withdrawal from Afghanistan. Leaving the region isn't going to make the problems go away. It's something we're going to still have to keep covering going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I just see more problems for India. I think we're going to see a continuing decline in Afghanistan. We're going to see the Taliban. If the U.S. truly leaves, and I believe it's going to happen, you're going to see parts of southern, eastern, southeastern, northeastern, even southwestern, even areas in the north where the Taliban are strong. They're going. The Afghan military has not been able to clear out the Taliban when it took over cities without U.S. air power, special operations forces. Afghan military is going to have to consolidate control, and the Taliban, they're good at what they do. It might take time. It might be bloody for them, but they're committed to doing it. And but the Pakistanis are going to continue. They've been their policy of strategic depth and support for jihadists. It's been verified as working. Why should they end it now? Particularly when they're never going to be as strong as India militarily, politically, or economically. It's a country with probably 1/8 the population of India, far more dysfunctional politically and economically. So it's a one-trick pony. It knows that strategic depth works, and it's going to continue it.
So, you have regional actors are going to have to worry about this going forward. Of course, I think the Pakistanis are going to have to worry about this going forward because there's always the Frankenstein effect, which we talked about and touched on today, which was what you documented, what happened in northwestern frontier province and areas of Pakistan. And then I would say, on a concluding note here, even with the U.S. military desiring to get out of the war in Afghanistan, that doesn't mean that U.S. law enforcement and intelligence officials are going to have no job to do. It doesn't mean they're going to be out of business when it comes to tracking terrorist threats out of the region to Americans, of course. They're going to have to keep dealing with these issues going forward. And I think what we're worried about is that the victory message that we've already started seeing coming out of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban and all this, has the potential to be a boon for the global jihad once again. And that's really sort of what we're looking at. Whether or not there's another big plot is hatched from the region or not against the U.S. or its allies, the bottom line is that this has the potential to be a real shot in the arm for the jihadi movement in a way that people are probably not really thinking about. In any event, thank you again, everybody, for listening to this week's episode of Generation Jihad. Please do subscribe to the show. As a reminder, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else you listen to your shows. We'll see you again next week.